In 1775, a spark of rebellion lit the 13 colonies, igniting the American War of Independence. From these tense skirmishes at Lexington and Concord to the hard-fought victory at Saratoga, we'll paint the soldiers who stood at the heart of the revolution. Welcome to Warlord Games' Epic Battles Revolution. We're going to need an Army Painter Wargamer detail brush today, just to help pick out those intricate details on these wonderful miniatures. And we'll start off with the Loyalist British Infantry, and these have been primed with an Army Painter Uniform Grey spray. It's a nice neutral colour to begin with, especially as we're going to be painting a off-white colour later on. However, we will start off with a dragon red paint to pick out his coat. For this video today, we'll just concentrate on a singular rank and file infantryman so that we can see clearly what's going on at the front and the back of the miniature. We're going to paint on a good old yellow uniform trim and cuffs. These facing colours for the British were used to help identify the different regiments on the battlefield. As the war continued on, uniforms had to be reissued and repaired, or even replaced. And due to the fact that original dyes weren't always available, some regiments may have had noticeable colour variations. And speaking of variations, we're going to have two different ways of painting skin for our Loyalist and our Continental soldiers, just so that you could have a bit of variety in your collection. It's time to pick out the darker items of clothing now, such as the hats, the shoes, the gaiters, that kind of thing. Well, pretty much anything that isn't going to be the lighter coloured breeches. You'll also notice that the musket and the bayonet have been base coated black. And this will help when we paint the metals and the wood in a moment. The hair and the musket itself was picked out with a darker brown, such as Brigadine Brown here. But likewise with the skin, you could mix it up and have a bit of variation with the hair colour as well. Maybe go for a blonde or a grey. And speaking of grey, it's like we've planned this. Ash grey was used to pick out the straps, the breeches and his waistcoat. For the waistcoat and the breeches, just leave a little bit of that uniform grey spray that we did right at the start, as this will act as a bit of shading for our clothing. The final few details, which was picked out with this ancient stone colour, are the coat turnbacks, which are situated at the front and the back of the coat, which is basically kind of like the inside lining of the coat. We also picked out the belt at this stage and the knapsack, which could be stuffed full of goodies such as spare socks, salted pork and biscuits, tins, cups and spoons, or even pipes and tobacco. All the essentials when you're at war. The last detail to pick out are the metals. So we're looking at the bayonet here as well as the metal parts of the actual gun itself. And don't forget about the tinned canteen. Although wooden canteens were most common with iron or brass banding, and they would be pretty good to paint on, say, something like the Continental Army or the militia. After applying the base coats, we can really bring the miniature to life by adding some shading. Still using our detail brush, carefully pick out the red coat with the Army Painter dark red shade. Try to avoid as best as you can the ash grey straps that we painted earlier, as well as the yellow trim. Because we're going to be using a light tone for that, but make sure that your dark red tone beforehand is completely dry. We do not want them to run in together and merge to create a mucky mess. This light tone was used in quite a few places, including the skin, the hair, as well as the coat turnbacks and the knapsack. As light tone was used for the previous areas, this time we're going to go for a dark blue tone for the breeches, as well as the waistcoat. This way there will be some extra contrast between our cooler bluer tones that we're painting now against the warmish yellow tones which we have previously applied. And to darken our silver metals just a little bit, a tiny amount of dark tone was just blobbed onto the bottom of the bayonet. With the washes thoroughly dry at this point, you could leave our loyalist British infantry as is and paint the rest of his unit, and it will look good enough for the tabletop. Or keep following along as we're about to paint the details. Pure Red by Army Painter was used to highlight the cloth, and this just brought out some of those lighter tones after we used our dark red tone before. Don't cover everything here from the previous layer, just try and hit the highlights, like the shoulders and the arms. And if you're feeling extra legendary, see what I did there, you could even add a secondary highlight of legendary red to bring out the highlights even further. Granted, this is an extra step and you may not want to do this on a lowly soldier. However, you might like to do this on a character and make them stand out a bit more on the tabletop. To make the yellow details pop out a bit more on this small scale miniature, a super bright demonic yellow was the colour of choice here. One small tip when painting miniatures this small is to just have a tiny little bit of paint on the very tip of your brush. This will help pick out any details and highlights, including the odd button, if you want to go that far. We're just using the ruby skin here and highlighting the upper areas of the face, such as the cheeks, the nose, and the chin. And for the hands, just picking out the knuckles will be more than enough. For the details on the back of the miniature, like the hair, you could pick them out whilst we're highlighting them. I mean, your opponent on the tabletop isn't going to notice from their side of the board, but as you're going to be stood behind them, you will. You will. The wood on the musket had a single layer of dryad brown, just to brighten it up a little bit more. You could also use this colour on the wooden canteens if you painted them that way rather than the silver tin colour. And these same brown colours were used for the wooden muskets for the Continentals, so we'll skip over that when we get to them later on. For the turnbacks and the knapsack, we just went with one single highlight for these. And whilst we're painting these miniatures, remember that these are going to be in a rank and file, and we're only painting the front rank now. Once we've painted the second rank behind them, you won't see some of the back details from the first rank as much, so keep that in mind if you want to time save a little bit. However, it's definitely worth highlighting the boots and the hat, especially from the front, as that's where most of the visual interest is going to be as you're looking at the unit. However, if you feel inclined to highlight the back of the unit, then we picked out the cartridge box with the deep grey highlight as well. And for the final segment for our loyalist is to pick out the lighter areas of his clothing. And for that we used a company grey paint, which is a really nice off-white light grey colour. And this was used to layer over and highlight the ash grey paint that we used earlier, leaving some of that previous colour and shading in the recesses, just to give it that definition that we need. And finally, the same colour was used on the brim edge of the tricorn hat to finish off the look of our loyalist soldier. And now for the Continental Infantry, and we start with an Imperial Navy for the blue coats. Again, starting from that uniform grey Army Painter spray. There are going to be a few colours which will be exactly the same as our loyalist, such as the hat, the musket, the turnbacks and the knapsack, so we'll just skirt over these and not duplicate the same information, and just look back at the loyalist segment of the video. Whilst we use the dragon red for the loyalist redcoats, we're going to use the same colour for the trim of our Continentals. To make these units even more interesting, I'd say give them a few different hair colours within the unit, just for a bit of variety. And to try out a different hair colour, we're going to go blonde this time. Similar to our loyalist counterparts, we are going to use ash grey for the breeches, the waistcoat and the straps. However, we are going to use a different wash later on to give them a bit more variation from the loyalist infantry. And to do that, we could even add a few different colours for the gaiters and the leggings on the leg. For this soldier, we're going to use a dusty skull paint, which is going to be placed in between the shoe and the breeches. Now that we have all the base coats added on, we can start applying the shading. And to start things off, a dark blue tone was added to the blue coats. To help shade these miniatures, really just try and poke in the bristles into the recesses of the miniature itself. That way these shade paints will glide into the areas that you want it to go into, giving you full control. And if you could use the same shade paint for multiple purposes on a miniature, then that's a bonus as well, just like what we've done with the light tone here. A little time-saving tip there. The final shade for the clothing is the red trim on the blue coat, and we just use a dark red tone, very similar to what we did with the Loyalist's red coat. Once all the shade paints have completely dry, we've got some highlighting to do. And we'll start with the blue coats using royal blue, which is a tad ironic as they were not fans of the British monarchy at the time. But for painting purposes, just pick out the highlights on the folds of the cloth, like the elbows and the shoulders. Earlier, whilst we were painting the Loyalist, we mentioned that we were going to do a couple different variations of skin tones. And this is always quite nice if you want a bit of variety going on in your army, especially if you have some Hessians or even Indian allies. Which brings us to the question of the day. What would you like to see in the next video? A painting guide for Hessians or a painting guide for Indians? Let us know in the comments section. Another little painting tip here is to always do a singular test model first before you move on to your whole army. That way you can work out what colours you'll need and how the army will look like as a whole once it's completed. So try it out. Do a single figure on a base like this first, and then work through your units accordingly. For the leg details, a highlight of Tunking Tan was used on the gaiters or the leggings that we have going on. And it's these kind of details on these epic scale miniatures which make them look even more interesting, especially when you're painting them and indeed when they're on the tabletop in their vast units and their armies. And if you're a stickler for detail or even have time to burn, you could pick out the even smaller details like this leather hairband, or even the buttons on the coat. Either way, we really hope that you enjoy painting epic battles or revolution.